We already know that soybean aphids and soybean cyst nematodes can drag down soybean yields. But now, Iowa State researchers have found the presence of aphids in a field can actually increase the likelihood that field will have SCN. Mike McCarville, who now works with Bayer CropScience, conducted the research with Matt O'Neill and Greg Tilka at ISU as part of his master's and PhD work. We recently talked with Mike about the discovery and why he thought to look into a possible link between the two.
Soybean aphids and soybean cyst nematode are both invasive to the U.S. and when you look at them, they both feed from similar parts of the plant. Even though one's above ground and one's below ground, they're both feeding from the vascular tissue of the plant, which moves nutrients about the plant. And then researchers that were working on each pest individually saw that both interact with the plant quite a bit and actually can manipulate the plant's defenses. So we kind of thought two pests that might be manipulating the soybean plant's defenses and feeding from similar tissue in the plant could have a large potential to interact.
What did your field trials show when you took this out to the actual soybean plant?
Yeah, so we originally started out in a field with some really small plots, maybe about 10 plants large, and we saw some huge increases of almost 5 times more nematodes when we added aphids to plants. We've since kind of built that project up, and we've looked at now larger plots, more something that a farmer would be familiar with. And kind of what we've seen is there's a direct relationship between how long the aphid is on the plant and how much we see in increases in nematode populations. We see about a 33% increase in every generation of SCN reproduction that overlaps with soybean aphids. Now this is especially concerning because in the Midwest we can get 3 to 6 generations of SCN reproduction.
We know that you take a yield hit from aphids, we know that you take a yield hit from soybean cyst nematode, but when the two of them come together, what does it do to yield?
So we don't have a great handle on that yet. We know individually that aphids can reduce yield by up to 40%, and we know that nematodes can reduce yield by up to 50%. Now with both, the amount of yield hit that you're going to get is directly proportional to how many of each one of those pests is on the plant. For nematodes, we see kind of a strong relationship with both the number of nematodes at the beginning of the season and how much reproduction we get throughout the season. So anything that's going to increase that, like aphid feeding, increasing nematodes, is going to increase the loss that we see from soybean cyst nematode.
You said it mattered how long the aphids were on the soybean plant. Does it then further reinforce the need to control aphids when they reach a certain threshold?
Yeah, so right now farmers are recommended to spray soybean aphids at 250 aphids per plant. There's a large data set that's built around that for the Midwest, and that seems to be a good recommendation. However, that was built in the absence of thinking about this soybean cyst nematode problem. So we don't have a good handle yet on how that might shift that threshold. In the field, we've seen aphid populations as low as 50 per plant actually increase nematode reproduction. So we know that 250 threshold that we have for aphids isn't going to be able to handle this increase that we see in nematode populations. But we don't have a good feeling on how we should adjust those recommendations just yet.
Your research was done in Iowa, sponsored by the Iowa Soybean Association, but do you think it carries to Nebraska or Illinois or Minnesota or other regions that heavily grow soybeans?
Absolutely. Obviously, we talked about the overlap and how long aphids are present on the plant being important. So one big key piece of that is going to be, we know as we move into more northern geographies like Minnesota and the Dakotas, soybean aphids tend to show up earlier in the season. So there's a potential for the importance to be even greater there and then kind of diminish as we go south. So I think a big driver is going to be how much overlap there is between soybean aphids and soybean cyst nematodes. When you overlap their distribution map, you're talking about a lot of geographies. What it means in each one, though, is going to depend on probably the ecology of both pests. When aphids show up, how often they're going to be present, those types of things. We can also get into, soybean cyst nematodes. Really, its ability to damage the plant is dependent on soil type, soil moisture, a lot of those kind of factors that vary geography to geography. So I think this is going to be something that we need to get a better handle on the environmental factors so that we can start to ratchet in any sort of extension recommendations that we give growers.
Mike, does it matter what variety, if you plant a variety that's SCN resistant, does it appear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's one of our biggest concerns going into this, was we saw a lot of problems in the field with the most common source of SCN resistance, PI 88788. That represents over 95% of the SCN resistant varieties out there, which is what farmers are primarily using to manage SCN. So we see soybean aphids able to cause SCN increases on both the susceptible soybean varieties for nematodes, but also on the PI 88788 resistant varieties. So those farmers who are struggling the most with nematodes, this interaction is going to be critical for their fields.
As we've told you before, UNL Extension believes SCN cost Nebraska soybean growers $45 million in lost yields during the 2013 season, more than all other diseases combined.